In February of 1987, an anonymous tip led police to a park in Tallahassee, Florida, where they found two well-dressed men in suits with six filthy, hungry, disoriented children. The children were dirty, bug-bitten, unwashed, and according to court records and news reports, had apparently been living in the back of a van. The men would not fully explain who the children were, and police say one of them claimed they were on their way to a school in Mexico. Within hours, those two arrests opened the door to one of the strangest and most disturbing cases of the 1980s. What investigators say they found next made the story even darker. Disturbing images involving children, ritual-like scenes, animal bloodletting, and one photograph reportedly showing a child in chains. So before we go any further, a quick heads up. This story includes troubling details involving children and animals. I'll keep it tasteful, but if that is not something you want to hear, you may want to skip those sections. The thing is, those two men were not just random drifters in a park. Police believe they were connected to a secretive Washington area group called the Finders, a group tied to a Virginia farm, a D.C. warehouse, strange communal beliefs, children raised apart from their parents, and a man named Marion Pettie, a figure former followers described almost like a guru, a game master, and the person who told everyone else what to do. And the more I read into this case, the more shocked I got, because this is one of those stories where the facts alone sound unbelievable. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is Echoes and Oddities. And on this channel, we dig into the strange, dark, forgotten, and the deeply unsettling stories that make you stop and say, wait, what? And this case definitely did that to me. Because when I first came across the story of the Finders, I thought it was going to be one of those cases that had been exaggerated over the years. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it got. There was a real investigation. There were real arrests. There were real raids. There were disturbing materials seized. And then, layered over all of that, came the rumors, the conspiracy theories, and the claims of a cover-up. So tonight, we're going to walk through what happened, what was alleged, what was actually documented, and why this case still unsettles people all these years later. It all began on February 4th, 1987, when Tallahassee police received an anonymous call about two well-dressed men supervising six disheveled children in a neighborhood park. When officers arrived, what they found immediately raised alarms. The children, who ranged from very young to elementary school age, were described in reporting and court documents as dirty, hungry, agitated, and unkempt. Authorities believed they had been living in the rear of the van the group was traveling in. The two men were identified as Douglas Ammerman and Michael Holwell, who was also reported under the name Michael Houlihan. They were arrested on child abuse or neglect-related charges, and the case exploded almost instantly because police still did not have clear answers about who exactly the children belonged to, why they were in Florida, or where they had come from. And that right there is part of what made this case hit so hard. It was not just that the children looked neglected. It was the mystery. Who were these men? Why were they traveling with six children? Why were the answers so vague? And why did this trail lead back to a hidden little group in Washington, D.C. that most people had never even heard of? At the center of it all was Marion Pettie, the man authorities and former members described as a central figure behind the Finders. By 1987, Pettie was about 66 years old, and former followers described him as a powerful, dominating presence inside the group. Some said they called him the student, the stroller, the game caller, or the pathfinder. They described a man who lectured followers about a new age way of living, Eastern mysticism and personal transformation, and who seemed to have an almost eerie level of influence over the people around him. And what is so interesting, and honestly so chilling in hindsight, is that this did not begin as the kind of group people would immediately picture when they hear the word cult. According to contemporaneous reporting, the Finders grew out of what had once been a popular 1960s hippie refuge, connected to Pettie's 90-acre farm in Madison County, Virginia, near Shenandoah National Park. People who had visited the property in the late 1960s and early 1970s described it as the kind of place where travelers, hippies, and peace activists could get an organic meal without charge and without questions. Back then, it sounded less like a sinister underground organization and more like a counterculture haven built around communal living and alternative ideas. But over time, that image changed. By 1987, reporting described the finders as what remained of that earlier refuge, after it had evolved into a secretive, communal society dedicated to communalism and what some sources described as studying the future. Neighbors said the old hippie atmosphere had faded. The barefoot idealism of the late 60s had, in some places, given way to men in business suits, women in professional clothing, stricter internal structure, and a level of secrecy that made outsiders deeply uneasy. That shift is important, because this was not just a loose commune anymore. By the time the Tallahassee arrests happened, the finders were being described as a group with houses in Washington, a warehouse in Northeast D.C., and ties to the Virginia farm. Former members and reporting described children being raised communally, sometimes separated from their parents, while Pettie remained the central authority figure. One affidavit in the case even quoted a child as saying, "Marion Pettie tells everyone what to do. He is in charge." And for me, that is one of the details that really sticks. Because once you hear that, once you picture a child saying that this one man is in charge of everyone, the entire story starts feeling even darker. As investigators dug further, they connected Ammerman and Hallwell to this larger group of roughly 40 people linked to the finders. Reporting at the time tied the group to a Glover Park residence in Washington, a Northeast D.C. warehouse, and the Virginia property. The public still did not know much about them, but what began to emerge was a picture of a highly unusual group that many people found odd long before the arrests in Florida. Former followers described complex beliefs, strange games, communal child-rearing, and a culture where Pettie's ideas shaped almost every part of life. Outsiders described the group as private, mysterious, and difficult to understand. And when police raided finders-linked properties after the Tallahassee arrests, that mystery turned into national headlines almost overnight. Because inside those properties, investigators said they found photographs and slides involving children, images from animal bloodletting ceremonies, and the now infamous report of a photograph showing a child in chains. Authorities also seized computers, software, and other materials that only deepened suspicion at the time. Now, later reporting would complicate some of the earliest claims and show that parts of this case were far murkier than they first appeared. But in those first days of February 1987, to the public, this looked like the discovery of something deeply hidden and deeply wrong. And once police started searching finders' properties in D.C. and Virginia, the story stopped feeling like a child neglect case and started sounding like something out of a nightmare. Investigators traced the two men back to properties connected to the group, including a Northeast Washington warehouse, a Glover Park residence, and the Virginia farm tied to Marion Pettie and the finders. What they said they found inside is part of why this case exploded so fast. Authorities removed bags filled with color slides, photographs, and contact sheets from the warehouse. According to contemporaneous reporting, investigators also seized computers and software from the warehouse, from the Glover Park property, and from the van recovered in Tallahassee. And then came the details that turned public suspicion into outright horror. Officials involved in the early investigation said the materials included disturbing images involving children, photographs connected to what they described as ritual-like scenes, images from animal bloodletting ceremonies, and one photograph reportedly showing a child in chains. U.S. Customs was also brought in to help review some of the material, and at the time, officials said they were looking into whether a child exploitation operation might be involved. Now, this is the part where, as a viewer, and honestly as a person just reading through all of this, it is hard not to recoil a little. Because whatever the full truth was, these were not the kinds of things people expect to hear when a story begins with two men and a group of children in a public park. This was suddenly a story about hidden rooms, seized photographs, strange records, communal secrecy, and children at the center of it all. And in the first wave of reporting, it looked like authorities had stumbled onto something deeply disturbing, operating just under the surface. Court documents and police sources at the time pushed that fear even further. One confidential source quoted in reporting had described the finders as a cult that used brainwashing techniques and involved children in rituals, though that source reportedly said they had not personally witnessed abuse. Those allegations, combined with the seized material, helped fuel the image of the finders as something far darker than a strange commune. And this is where the story really takes on that late 1980s panic energy. Because once words like cult, rituals, and children hit the news at the same time, the case took on a life of its own. The finders were no longer just a secretive social experiment with bizarre beliefs. In the public imagination, they were becoming something much more sinister and much more sensational. But even here, there is something important to keep in mind. Those early days were full of fear, rumor, and rapidly escalating claims. And while the discoveries during the raids were disturbing enough on their own, some of the most explosive ideas attached to the group would later become much murkier. Within days, parts of the narrative started to shift, and investigators were no longer speaking with the same level of certainty they had in the beginning. So in the moment, this looked like the uncovering of a hidden cult network. But as the headlines spread, the line between documented evidence and public panic started getting harder and harder to see. For a brief moment, it looked like police had uncovered one of the darkest cult cases in America. The headlines made it sound like evil had been uncovered in plain sight. But within days, the case would get even stranger, because some of the most horrifying claims were suddenly far less certain than they first appeared. For a brief moment, it looked like police had uncovered one of the darkest cult cases in America. The headlines made it sound like evil had been uncovered in plain sight. But within days, the case would get even stranger, because some of the most horrifying claims were suddenly far less certain than they first appeared. And this is where the Finders case stops being a straight, terrifying headline story and starts becoming something much harder to pin down. Because almost as quickly as the panic spread, parts of the official narrative began to shift. In those early days, investigators and news reports had used words like cult, rituals, and even satanic. But within less than a week, that language started softening. On February 11, 1987, the Washington Post reported that Tallahassee police had dropped their description of the finders as a satanic cult, and district police said they had no evidence indicating the group held satanic beliefs. That alone is a huge turn, because once a case gets branded that way in the public mind, once people hear the words children, rituals, and cult all in the same breath, it is almost impossible to pull that story back. Even if the facts turn out to be more complicated, the fear moves faster than the truth. And the complications kept coming. Authorities in Virginia used a backhoe to dig up a section of land at the Finders farm after receiving tips that bodies might be buried there. They found nothing. At the same time, a child abuse expert hired by Florida's Social Service Agency examined the 6 children and concluded there was not enough evidence to say whether they had been sexually abused, while psychologist Nathan Greenberg said he found no evidence of recent physical harm. Now, that does not mean everything was suddenly normal. It does not erase the condition the children were found in. It does not erase the fact that the whole situation was disturbing enough to spark raids in multiple places. And it definitely does not erase the strange, secretive way this group lived. But it does mean the case was no longer as simple as the first headlines made it sound. Because now, investigators were dealing with something messier. A deeply unusual communal group, children being raised in ways outsiders found alarming, shocking material seized during raids, and allegations that were becoming harder to prove as the investigation moved forward. And honestly, this is one of the reasons the Finders case has stayed so haunting for so long. Not because everything was clearly proven, but because so much about it sat in this horrible gray area. The children were still in state care. The two men, Douglas Ammerman and Michael Holwell, were still facing misdemeanor neglect charges at that point. Florida officials were still trying to sort out who all the parents were, and the group's secrecy was making everything harder. One report even noted how puzzled authorities were that the Finders had not moved more aggressively to reclaim the children right away. And then there was Marion Pettie. Even while the public story was changing, Pettie still hung over the case like a shadow. Reporting described him as the group's founder and central figure, and one affidavit quoted a child saying, "Marion Pettie tells everyone what to do. He is in charge." The same reporting said Pettie's whereabouts were being kept secret, though former members said he remained in daily phone contact with the group. That detail really matters, because even as the most explosive claims started weakening, the picture that remained was still deeply unsettling. A private group built around one powerful figure, children raised communally and with little ordinary structure, adults who refused to explain themselves clearly, and a case that seemed to get stranger each time someone tried to clarify it. And that is what makes this section so eerie. The story did not cleanly collapse. It just got murkier. The satanic cult framing weakened. The buried body rumors went nowhere. Some of the strongest early fears were no longer being stated with confidence. But what remained was still troubling enough that public suspicion did not disappear. It just changed shape. So instead of a clean ending, the Finders case entered a new phase. One where the biggest question was no longer just what did police uncover, it became something even more frustrating. What exactly was this group? And how much of the horror was real? How much was rumor? And how much would never be fully answered? And while some of the wildest claims were starting to fall apart, the most important part of the case was still unresolved. What would happen to the children? Because once the headlines faded a little, and once the rumors started colliding with the actual evidence, 6 children were still sitting in state custody, and the courts now had to decide whether they should go home at all. This part of the story is less sensational than the raids and the headlines. But in a lot of ways, it is the part that hits the hardest. Because underneath all the talk of cults, rituals, and conspiracies, there were still 6 children whose lives had just been thrown into chaos. In mid-February 1987, officials said the children, who ranged from about 2 to 7 years old, would remain in emergency shelters until a March 9th hearing, where the state would argue over whether they should be declared dependents. Florida officials also made clear that even though the law generally tries to reunite families, neglect proceedings could still lead to major state intervention. At that point, Douglas Ammerman and Michael Holwell had pleaded not guilty to misdemeanor neglect charges, and prosecutors argued that the mystery surrounding the case justified the unusually high bond. Authorities were still trying to sort out who the children's parents were, and the group's own communal ideas about parenthood only made things more confusing. One Finders member reportedly told the Washington Post that the father of record was not necessarily the biological father, adding, "We're all fathers of all the kids." And honestly, that detail says so much about why this case became such a nightmare for the state to untangle. Because this was not a normal custody situation. This was a private group with an unusual child-rearing philosophy, children raised communally, adults who often refused to answer clearly, and a leader, Marion Pettie, whose influence still seemed to shape what everyone else did. At the time, Florida authorities even said they were puzzled that the Finders had not moved more aggressively to reclaim the children right away, even though group representatives insisted the mothers wanted them back. And then, months later, the case split in a way that made the whole situation even sadder. According to the Washington Post, the two men arrested in Florida spent 6 weeks in jail before a judge dismissed the child abuse charges. In March, 4 of the children were returned to their mothers after those mothers retained a Florida lawyer and went through the legal process. But 2 children were not returned. A Florida judge later declared them dependents of the state and ordered them placed in foster homes. And the reason those 2 children stayed behind is one of the most haunting parts of this entire case. The Post reported that, at Marion Pettie's direction, 2 mothers, Kristen Knauth and Pat Livingston, refused to hire a lawyer, refused to argue for the return of their children, and did not even remain in Florida to contest the case. According to attorney Paula Walborski, Pettie had told them that because the court supposedly had the children's best interests in mind, they should not participate in the judicial process. Just sit with that for a second. 2 mothers had children in state custody, and instead of fighting with everything they had to bring them home, they followed the direction of the group's leader and stepped back. That does not automatically prove some larger criminal conspiracy, but it absolutely shows the level of control Pettie still had over the people around him. And for me, that makes the story feel even more unsettling, because by this point, the issue is not just bizarre beliefs or communal living. It is the human cost of a leader having that much influence over how parents respond when their own children are taken away. Walborski told the Washington Post that those 2 children should have been returned, but because their mothers did not go through the legal system, the state felt they had effectively abandoned them when they went back to Washington. Florida's Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services confirmed that the 2 children, Ben Knauth, 4, and Max Livingston, 6, were placed in foster homes and that their cases would be reviewed every 6 months. And then there is one more detail that makes this case feel even stranger. Walborski also said the state presented no evidence that those 2 children had been abused or neglected, and that the judge declared them wards of the state for what she described as educational reasons. The hearing itself was closed to the public, and a state spokeswoman declined to comment on what happened inside. So by this point, the Finders case had become something deeply frustrating to pin down. The most explosive accusations had weakened. The men's neglect charges were dismissed. 4 children went back to their mothers. 2 did not. And instead of a dramatic courtroom ending where everything suddenly made sense, the case just drifted into this unsettling fog. Part scandal, part custody battle, part social experiment gone wrong. And maybe that is exactly why people never let it go. Because there was no clean ending. No moment where the public got one simple answer. Just a trail of raids, allegations, frightened headlines, children caught in the middle, and a group so strange and secretive that even when parts of the story fell apart, it still never stopped feeling wrong. And this is where the Finders case stops being just an eerie child neglect investigation from 1987 and starts turning into something people argue about to this day. Because after the arrests, the raids, the foster care fight, and all the confusion that followed, the story did not just disappear. It lingered. And by the early 1990s, old allegations about the Finders were surfacing again, this time tied to claims that federal agencies had either backed away from the investigation or quietly shut parts of it down. In December 1993, the Associated Press reported that the Justice Department was looking into allegations that the CIA had used a so-called front company run by the commune to train agency employees and had blocked investigation of the group. The CIA denied those claims. A CIA spokesman called the allegations ridiculous, and AP reported that the company at the center of that part of the story was Future Enterprises, Inc., which had provided computer training to CIA employees. AP also reported that one Finders member, Robert Garter Terrell, had worked for that company before being let go in February 1987. Now, this is the part where a lot of people go from "this case is disturbing" to "this case must have been covered up." Because on the surface, it sounds explosive. You have a bizarre group, You have disturbing evidence claims. You have children in the middle of the case. And then suddenly you have intelligence rumors and a company connected to CIA training. That is the kind of combination that keeps a story alive for decades. And honestly, I get why people latched onto it. It sounds like the plot of a thriller. But this is where we have to slow down and separate the chills from the proof. Because when you look at the later FBI material, the record gets a lot less dramatic than the rumors. In the released file, an FBI summary says that on February 18, 1987, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington declined prosecution for violations of federal kidnapping and sexual exploitation statutes. Another FBI memo says that the evidence seized in the Washington searches produced no evidence of child sexual exploitation, kidnapping, or related crimes. That does not mean the whole thing suddenly becomes harmless or normal. It does not mean people imagine the condition of the children. It does not mean the group was not deeply strange. And it definitely does not mean every question was answered. But it does matter that, in the later federal record, some of the biggest allegations were not backed up in the way people expected. And then there is one more piece that really complicates the cover-up theory. In the FBI material, Tallahassee Police Chief Mel Tucker is quoted as saying there was never any outside agency, inside or outside the intelligence community, that contacted his department in an attempt to influence its investigation of the finders. A related FBI summary says the Tallahassee portion of the investigation was not impeded/influenced in any way by any agency or improper considerations. That is a huge detail, because if you are telling this story honestly, you cannot leave that out. The later conspiracy version of the Finders case often gets told like there is a clean, proven line from the raids in 1987 to a confirmed CIA operation. But the released records do not give you that clean line. What they give you instead is something much murkier: allegations, congressional interest, customs documents that fueled suspicion, a real company called Future Enterprises that had trained CIA employees, and then federal records that say the most direct claims of outside interference were not substantiated. And honestly, to me, that almost makes the case feel stranger. Because a solved story is easier to live with. A story where you can point and say, there, that was the answer. That is comforting. But the Finders never really gives you that. Instead, it leaves you with a disturbing 1987 case, a secretive communal group, children caught in the middle, sensational claims that partly unraveled, and then years later, a second wave of suspicion built around the possibility that something else had been happening behind the curtain. The records do not fully prove that bigger hidden operation, but they do explain why the case never truly died. And that is why this story still gets dragged back into the light over and over again. Not because every conspiracy has been proven, but because the case was bizarre enough, unsettling enough, and incomplete enough that people have been trying to force it into a neat explanation ever since. A satanic cult. A social experiment gone wrong. A media panic. A hidden intelligence front. A custody case twisted into legend. Depending on who is telling it, the Finders becomes any one of those things. But the truth is probably harder than that. Because the scariest version of this story is not the cleanest one. It is the possibility that something deeply abnormal really was happening, and that even after all the files, all the headlines, and all the years that followed, the public still never got one simple answer. So after all of that, we are left with the biggest question of all. What can we actually say about the Finders for sure? And what still lives in the fog of rumor, panic, and conspiracy? Because this is the kind of story that gets retold over and over again until the facts and the legends start blending together. And when that happens, the truth can get buried under the shock of it all. So let's slow this all the way down. Because if you strip away the panic, the rumors, and the decades of conspiracy talk, there are still some things about the finders that are clearly documented. There really was a secretive Washington area group called the Finders. There really was a leader named Marion Pettie, and contemporary reporting described him as the central figure in a communal social experiment that grew out of a late 1960s counterculture refuge in Virginia. There really were two Finders members arrested in Tallahassee in February 1987 after police found them with 6 dirty, unkempt children. And there really were searches of Finders-linked properties in Washington and Virginia that turned this into a national story. There is also no getting around the fact that this case was disturbing. The children were real. The neglect concerns were real. The secrecy was real. The raids were real. And early reporting documented that investigators said they found troubling materials, including images involving children, ritual-like scenes, and animal bloodletting photographs, all of which helped drive the case into the public imagination as something sinister and deeply hidden. But this is where the line has to be drawn, because the strongest and most terrifying version of the Finder story, the version where everything is neatly explained as a proven satanic cult, a child trafficking ring, or a confirmed CIA operation, is not what the released record clearly proves. Within days of the first explosive reports, Tallahassee police dropped the satanic cult label. The search for buried bodies at the Virginia farm found nothing, and child abuse specialists said the evidence did not allow clear conclusions of sexual abuse, while one psychologist reported no evidence of recent physical harm. And later, the federal record only made the picture stranger, not cleaner. The FBI file later posted in the FBI vault under Frequently Requested helped revive the case for a new generation. Those later records and reporting show why people stayed suspicious. There were customs documents, Justice Department interest in allegations involving the CIA, and the revelation that future enterprises had trained CIA employees in computer use. But the same record also includes federal findings that the searches did not produce evidence of child sexual exploitation, kidnapping, or related crimes. And later reporting noted that the 1987 charges did not result in prosecution. And that matters, because if we are being honest, the Finders case is not scary because everything was conclusively solved. It is scary because it was not. It sits in that awful gray space where a group can be plainly bizarre, deeply secretive, and troubling enough to alarm police and the public, while still leaving behind a record that does not fully support every horrifying claim later attached to it. There is another hard truth here, too. Even if some of the biggest claims weakened, the human cost was still real. 6 children were pulled into the center of this case. 4 were eventually returned to their mothers, while 2 were placed in foster homes after their mothers, according to reporting at the time, did not stay and contest the proceedings. That part is not legend. That part is not internet myth. That part happened. And maybe that is why this story still lingers the way it does, because it never gives people the ending they want. It does not end with a clean conviction that explains everything. It does not end with a neat debunking that makes the whole thing disappear. It leaves behind a secretive communal group, a leader with unusual influence, neglected-looking children, disturbing seized material, a wave of moral panic, and then years of suspicion layered over top of all of it. The case is unresolved in the emotional sense, even if parts of it were legally or investigatively closed. And honestly, I think that is the version of this story that unsettles me the most. Not the version where every conspiracy is true. Not the version where every rumor is false. But the version where something clearly abnormal was happening. Something secretive, controlling, and hard for outsiders to understand. And even after the raids, the hearings, the headlines, the federal files, and all the years that followed, the public was still left staring into the same fog, trying to figure out where the truth ended and the legend began. So when people ask whether the finders were a cult, a panic-fueled media scandal, a social experiment gone wrong, or something even darker, the most honest answer may be this: they were real. The investigation was real. The fear was real. The mystery was real. But the full truth of what the finders really were is still one of those stories that never settled into one clean answer. And that is what makes the finders' case so hard to forget. Not because every theory was proven, not because every rumor was true, but because just enough of this story was real to leave behind a darkness that never fully went away. A secretive group, children caught in the middle, disturbing discoveries, and a case that, even all these years later, still feels like it is hiding something just out of reach. If you made it to the end, let me know what you think. Was this a cult, a failed social experiment, a case of media panic, or something even stranger? And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or follow if you're listening on Spotify, because I share new episodes every week. Until next time, I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is Echoes and Oddities.